Thank you for hosting this series of conversations. And welcome, Jane. It's a pleasure to talk to you about your lovely book. Um, I We started talking a little bit earlier, but this is Bombay Balchao. Bombay. It's an absolutely delightful volume, a beautiful work about which brings to life a neighborhood, a classic, and what should I say, even a historically iconic neighborhood in Bombay, which has had which has a kind of a subculture, like so many of the neighborhoods in Bombay. It's also one in which Jane lives, and this is a book which in a way I resisted reading for some time for a number of different reasons. It was recommended to me again and again, but once actually I must say once lockdown began, I was looking for different things to read, which would kind of take me away from the obvious, which was all around me, and we were completely in a what should in a uh, intense kind of focus, intense of what was in front of us, which was mainly bad. And I read Bombay Balchao. I loved it. And then I passed it on, and both my mother and my aunt, Dr. Amida Fernandez, is also a Bombay person, have been reading it, and we all loved it. It was transporting. It's a very nicely balanced trip through the past, but not entirely nostalgic. It's also about a neighborhood. It's a great city book. And for those of us who relate to Bombay in particular, it's I think a terrific addition to the shelf of literature on that city. To honor you in a way, Jane, I'm wearing a T-shirt which has a BEST bus on it, which I bought in the city, not far from where you live. But first of all, congratulations! You're nominated for the Atta Galata Prize also, which is a lovely prize in India. So that's a terrific thing. And welcome to this conversation. I would like to mention at the outset that the book is available. There's a link which Leonard has provided, and it's also available. It's going to be available in a second in the chat, on in the sidebar, where you'll be able to get, I believe, a signed copy from Jane. Jane, tell us a little bit about how this book came about. So you are a journalist in Bombay, and how did this book come about? Why did you think of moving into fiction from a life spent in journalism and nonfiction? I cannot hear Jane.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So firstly, thank you so much, Leonard. Thank you, Vivek, for having me on the session. Um, uh, it's an absolute pleasure. And I've got to know Vivek only over the last few months. And so glad to get to speak to you today. Uh, to begin with, and yeah, thank you so much for your kind words about Bombay Balcha. I'm so glad you loved the book. Uh, I have not really moved away from journalism. I'm still very much a journalist. So Bombay Balchao just happened somewhere in between. Um, yes, after I wrote Mafia Queens of Mumbai, there's this tendency for you to get stereotyped as a crime nonfiction writer. And while it was an amazing experience to write nonfiction and manage to do research at when I was just 22, 23, go and meet um, some of the most menacing characters in the city, I was not so keen to continue. And somewhere, somewhere at the back of my head, I always knew I wanted to write fiction. I just did not know how. And this is the time when I really wanted to take a break from the city. This was to realign, to figure out what I really wanted from life. So I moved to Muscat, which is the city where I grew, which is in the Sultanate of Oman, and the city where I grew up in. And I was there for about 2 years there. But right at the outset, when I moved to Muscat, within a week of being there, I knew that I did not want to stay here long. Now, the problem is that once you get a job visa in Oman, you have to work there for at least a maximum of 2 years, or you will be banned. So that is the new immigration laws that they have. And for someone who was so closely attached to that city, I did not want to get banned, of course. So I knew I had to continue despite not enjoying every single moment of being there. And this is how I think these short stories happen, because I was missing home so much, and not just missing family, I was missing home. I realized that I was missing Cavell, and this is not something I would have thought about if I had left, if I was here in Cavell. I think once you get out of it, you realize what, this place means to you, what being, in home and belonging means to you. And for the first time, I started feeling that way, and I just started writing. So I began with these random short stories on my blog about Bombay. And then suddenly one day I started writing about a city that was, no, a place that was very familiar, like home. And it was not with the intention, obviously, to write a book. These were just disconnected short stories. And by the third or fourth chapter, I realized there was a pattern that was emerging, and there were characters that were similar, and I could make this into a novel. Now, I'm a writer who doesn't have the patience for a novel, and I think that comes from the kind of journalism background that I have. There is a sense of immediacy. There is something has to be done now, and that's it. So that patience I never had. And I think just writing these disconnected short stories, which eventually evolved into a novel, helped me develop some sense of, I don't know, it just made me a little more involved and absorbed in my storytelling, something that I wouldn't have otherwise. But that's it. So, by the time by the end of my 2-year stint in Muscat, I had written 5-6 stories, and I thought, yay, I think I have a novel in place. And I came back to Mumbai. I got a job in Midday. And this is when I started seriously looking for someone to give me some kind of feedback on the book. And the person who I first turned to was Vivek Menezes, who's he's a veteran journalist who used to be the former news editor at the Indian Express. And right. He's a resident of Cavell. He's lived here practically all his life. And when he read it, like I told you before, he trashed it. He trashed it to such an extent that it disappointed me. Now, Erbil is one person who's very blunt. He's just to your face. He's not someone who will mince words. And it's a very nice thing, because I kept the book aside. And I think in hindsight, it was a good thing that I let it just sit there, marinate, let time take its course, let my relationship with the city build a little before I could go back to the novel. And working as a journalist in Midday and covering the beats that I did, so urban planning, heritage, that got me a little more involved. I started engaging, because before this, I was a journalist with the Asian Age, but I was a sub-editor. So you're just editing news stories. It's just very banal as, a job. But here I was actually going out, speaking to people, learning stories, finding new things. And for the first time, I started taking my history seriously. So that is the background. And I think 2 years later, after having come from Muscat, I started looking back at this book a little more seriously. And that's Bombay Balchao for you. That's how it happened.
Nice. That's very interesting. I think it's undoubtedly true that your journalistic. I think you do need a bit of distance, first of all, but also steep. Looking at things outside the lens of purely nostalgia. If your book were purely nostalgic, but like so many books about the city, and in fact about our kind of communities tend to be, then they don't really reach to the realms of literature, right, or something that's worthwhile right. looking at. And I think that definitely plays a role. When I was reading it, so let's talk a little bit about Cavell. When I was reading your book, I was reminded. I had initial shocks of recognition, because many years ago, I guess over 20 years ago, I'd have to look up when it was due, when it was written. but I got one of the first copies of Tales from Firozshah Bagh, right, which
Right.
is Rohit
Yes.
Street, and it was I was probably a college student in the U.S., but I remember I was reading it, and these are also kind of interlinked stories about a community which and a history, but and it's about a family and the extended people around
Neighbors.
them,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
it's also about a community, which is the Parsis, and it's also intensely about a neighborhood and a locality,
Right.
right? So
Yes.
a wonderful, wonderful city book also. And in reading your book, I realized. So I was actually born in Bombay, and I grew up not. I spent many years growing up not far away from Cavell, but I realized I know quite little about Cavell. I do know one or two things, and perhaps you can correct me about
Right.
these things. One is that Cavell rose up, in fact, in the early years of colonialism of the British development of Bombay at that time, because people who worked for the British, or if you like, non-white people at least, were not
Right.
allowed to live in the white town, right? And the white town
Right.
or the white areas were fort.
Right.
And so many of the people who work for the British, and here you have the East Indian community to begin with, but also a number of Goans. I know there's Alfonso Mudot, who was this great baker figure
Yes.
who Teresa
Yes.
Albuquerque writes about, who kind of started to cross the color bar already in the 19th century. These people lived in Cavell, and
Right.
in order to serve the British, but they could live next to the British because they were not allowed. They lived in Cavell. So Cavell kind of developed as a small Catholic neighborhood in the heart of what is now the city, but at that point outside Fort. Is that
Right.
more or less right? And then how did you come to live in Cavell? Both these
So
questions.
yes. So that is um, somewhat correct. Cavell does have a pre-colonial history, but I wouldn't say if you're talking about British, before the British, it was the Portuguese, and so I think Cavell emerged somewhere in the 1600s. Um, just
Really?
this is when it was still part of the Portuguese. Bombay was still under the Portuguese, and it was um, these islands were technically very not habitable. And missionaries are said to have first settled in this part of town, Cavell, that is, present day Cavell. And not very far from here, you had Portuguese feudal lords in Fort, the present day Fort area, which is about a kilometer or two from Cavell, where they were trying to build proper settlements for the Portuguese. This is somewhere around the same time the islands go to the British, and the Portuguese continue staying there.
Really?
Yes, so this is the backstory, but not known to many. And this is something that even Teresa Albuquerque talks about. Uh, this part of Bombay and Cavell has a very Hindu history too, because in the 1880s, they excavated some coins from Cavell, and the coins that they found dated back to the Rashtrakut dynasty, which is somewhere between 300 to 3rd and 7th century AD. So it's that old. And that means this would have been a Hindu colony. We don't really know, or under this is a guess because they found coins from that era. But yes, it was a Portuguese heartland, very much so, and I'm guessing it just mushroomed into this very large native Christian colony or a township, as one would think. When I'm talking about the native Christians, I'm talking about the present day East Indians. They used to be called the Portuguese Christians. That is to separate their identity or to clearly demarcate that they were different from the Goan Christians. The Goans come in much later into the picture. After, there was the Battle of Bassein, uh, present day Vasai, and the Portuguese lost Bassein too. Now, many of them started moving down south. So they go to the Salsette, they go to Goa, and then they come to south, that is the south um, of, um, uh, of Mumbai, of present day Bombay. Um, because you have Portuguese missionaries here, and they have continued doing their work in this part of town, and not disturbed by the British. So this is the settlement. This is actually the history of the native Christians of Cavell. The Goans started, yes, the earliest. The Goans started coming here somewhere in the 1800s. And the reason why they settled in places like Cavell is because Cavell had two churches at that point. One is, pardon my Portuguese, but I'm guessing this is the pronunciation. One was Nossa Senhora de Sod, which is Our Lady of Health. And the other one is Nossa Senhora de Esperança, which is Our Lady of Hope. Now, both these churches were adjacent to each other, and they cater to the native Christian or the Portuguese Christians living here. For the Goans, for whom, again, when you come to a place unfamiliar, you're looking for something that is close to home. And back then, the church was what they identified with home. So settling in Cavell was the most, I would say, the thing to be done, because you have a church not very far away from home, and that precisely makes, is what you want to hold on to. That is how the Goans start settling here. And you know how it works with communities. So once a group of people come here, they're happy, they let their relatives back home know that this is just the place that you need to move in, and the numbers keep growing. By 1850s, so they started coming in boats. By 1850s, you have the steamer, and that means larger numbers, which is why even today in present day Cavell, you will have people from the same village. So there is Para, and I think a lot of people from that part of Goa still are in Cavell, and they all have, they have common roots to this particular part in Goa. So it's like villages moved here for jobs, and suddenly this entire township was brimming with Goan Christians. So it was an East Indian village, and a very rich East Indian village. I'm talking about landed East Indians. They had land, and I'm talking expansive lands. From the little I have read, I am told that there used to be, so not very far from Cavell, there's a place called Gaiwadi, and it's in the same lane. We still call it Gaiwadi, but there used to be a huge dairy farm at one point in the same lane. Similarly, on the other side of Cavell, we have something called Fanaswadi. So I'm guessing that used to be a jackfruit farm, or it used to be a farm comprising jackfruit trees or something of that sort. So these are very landed, rich East Indians, and you have Goan Christians first trickling in and then coming in large numbers, and now you have a mixed community of Goans and East Indians. So that is the background of Cavell, and this is how it emerged into a very, very thriving township. Around Cavell, you have other Christian neighborhoods like Dhobi Talau, Sonapur. I think you must be familiar with these townships, but they emerged over a period of time. Cavell the present day Cavell is just one single lane, but earlier Cavell used to cover the entire Chira Bazaar stretch. So right from Sonapur to your present day Dhobi Talau used to be known as Cavell. Now, the backstory to what happened or what went wrong and why Cavell was reduced to one lane is because of this huge Goan population that was taking over. And there was an obvious natural threat to the East Indian community. This was only, this increased with the whole Padroado-Propaganda, if you know about it. Padroado controversy, where churches were split, one under the Archbishop of Goa, the other under the church, the Vatican, or the Church of Italy. And this split caused some kind of friction because the Goans were given they were given a set of churches, and the cream was taken by the East Indians. Or that's how the British tried to do the whole divide and rule, I'm guessing. And even in Cavell, one church, that is present day Our Lady of Health, was only for the Goans. while Our Lady of Hope was for the East Indians. And nobody, and it was not a set thing, but people wouldn't go to the other churches. So if it's a Goan church, it's a Goan church, an East Indian church, you don't enter my church. The Goans are growing, and Cavell just has one chapel. So the church is actually very tiny and cannot fit that many number of Goans. That's how you have Dhobi Talao, that the St. Francis Xavier's church that comes up to cater to the large number of Goan Catholics in Cavell. And then you have a Dhobi Talao parish. Similarly, you have Our Lady of Dolors, which used to be where Cavelites, there was a graveyard not very far from here, which is why it's called Sonapur. That's where they built the third church, and it was called Our Lady of Dolors. So then you have these three parishes that just come up over a period of time to cater to the large number of Goans. Now, when Our Lady of Hope was brought down, it was the cathedral for the Catholics, but when Our Lady of Hope was brought down in the early 1900s, the East Indians moved to Cavell, Our Lady of Health. And again, there was friction, and I write about it in the book too, about how the East, and this is something that Vivek Menezes told me, that the East Indians would occupy the first few pews in the church, while the Goans were expected to sit behind. So there was a very strong class difference, and it was made known to, and it was very evident and made known. So that is the backstory of this interesting place called Cavell. Unfortunately, the churches that were built precisely to cater to the large Goan population today are languishing. You don't have that many parishioners. Can you hear me? I think it said I've
we can absolutely hear you. We can hear you very.
Yes. So I was saying that,
go ahead. It's super interesting, Jane. There are lots of different things there which I personally find fascinating and would love to explore. One of the things that certainly comes across in the way you were speaking is about this kind of sense of separate communities that came together in Cavell. One was, of course, the East Indians, who in a way their languages were Marathi and Portuguese.
Right.
And then you have the Goans, of course, who come across from Goa, whose languages were Portuguese and Konkani, and then English, and then English. And then, of course, you have coming in at the same time, but in lesser numbers, and perhaps, but nonetheless present, is the Mangaloreans, right? The Mangalorean Christians, who also come from whose languages in a way are Kannada and Konkani, and also English
Tulu,
as well.
English, yeah.
And these are to some extent disparate and competing communities which have inbuilt prejudices prejudices against each other. We shouldn't dwell on it too much, but we all kind of grew up with this idea that what the Mangaloreans say about the Goans, and what the Goans say about the Mangaloreans, and what the East Indians say about both of them. So that's very much there.
Right.
But what's interesting is that while these communities were disparate and competing at one point, and there was always spillover, as you point out in your novel. People, they all inhabit the same kind of cultural space, and so there were affections and solidarities and marriages and intermarriages that take place all along this entire period. Nonetheless, as we come towards the end of the 20th century and the 21st century and the world you inhabit, they all kind of collapse into each other, right? So
exactly.
One of the things about your book that struck me is that it is of course a history of Cavell. It's a Cavell history of Bombay, or Cavell history of the community, but it's also a portrait, and this again relates to Rowington Mystery's book. It's a portrait of a community that is dwindling, that almost doesn't exist and kind of collapses into each other. To what extent? Yet, I mean, this is the wonderful thing. Rowington Mystery of course, like many of these writers, sits in Canada. One of the wonderful things is you're right there in Cavell, right? And you're a young,
Right.
working, prolific writing woman who's right there in the heart of it. What does it feel like? First of all, tell me a little bit about how this community has collapsed into each other. Do these divides still and prejudices still play a role in someone like your life? And also, what is it like to kind of be
Right.
there? I mean, when most of the people your age, I'm guessing now, either on their way to New Zealand or Canada, or being told to go
Right.
to New Zealand or Canada. Right.
So very few of us, actually, very few young people in Cavell now, and just a handful. Everyone's moving, and every year you hear a new story of someone having found a lovely home in Australia, the US, Canada. But we came here somewhere in 2003. So I would call myself an outlier, actually, or somewhat of a flaneur in Cavell. We came in, most of the families that live here have had, you know, they go back generations, so they are like third, fourth generation still living here, and for them there has never been any other idea of home. They've been here, their families have been, they have histories that go back almost 200 years. Now we did buy this from a relative, and an East Indian relative, so my mom's brother's former wife, and they moved to Canada, and that's how we ended up buying this house here. So when we came here in 2003, for us it was very, very different as a place. For starters, I came from a place like Muscat, where we lived in a very hybrid kind of community. You had Pakistanis, Sri Lankans, Filipinos, and Omanis in your building, and suddenly I'm surrounded only with Catholics, and the conversation revolves around parish, feast, and Christmas, carols, and choir. And for me, that was a little unsettling, because I didn't know what, and I was about 16 at that point. So I was like, this is very strange, because everything they work, they live in isolation almost. The other world doesn't matter. What happens beyond Cavell Street is not their, is not part of their everyday plan, except for, say, going back to work and coming back home. So their life revolved around Cavell. And in the beginning, it seemed a little odd to me, because everyone was actually very nostalgic. When you spoke to neighbors, especially a lot of the elderly in the neighborhood, they always, spoke very highly about their community and what it was. And it was always about what it was, because it was actually, there was nothing to the place when I came here. And I kept thinking why my parents decided to buy a really old home in Bombay when there were so many other better options. It's only after I went into journalism and started getting curious about the history of this place that I realized, that I was sitting in something that I was on land that I needed to take pride about. My building had three mayors. We had three mayors of the city had come from Cavell, from my building alone. And Dr. Vegas, the one who we when we talk about the bubonic plague, we speak about Dr. Gabriel Vegas. His father was from Cavell. So there's such interesting histories, and I always wanted. And Olga Valadares, so she was a Cavellite for a long time before she got married. So I always wondered why people were not speaking about these things. And these were real experiences, and either the young did not know about it, or it was best forgotten. And I think being an outsider, being somewhat of a person who was on the fringes, who was not completely involved, made me see or maybe involved in the community or part of the community, made me see the community in different light. I could see its greatness when everyone else thought it was ordinary. And I think that helped being an outsider who lived somewhere else and came into Cavell at that point in time, because that was when we were actually making that little shift. For the first, I remember I was part of the youth group. I used to play the organ in church, and we were very, very alive for the first 6-7 years. And I think by the turn of 2010, everything started changing. Some of my youth members started leaving, going abroad, or say moved to the suburbs because living in South Bombay was obviously getting expensive. And those things started changing. And that's when I realized that, oh God, this community is not the community anymore. I remember recently playing for one of my friend's wedding, and the entire a Cavellite's wedding, who's also a friend, and some of us, the youngsters who used to sing then, we got together after nearly 8 years, and all we could think about was what a glorious past we had, and that we're never going to get it back again. So these are things that I think need documenting, and nobody is doing it. So, well, I started.
Yeah, I think that's lovely, and that's one of the reasons your book is so valuable. I think that there's a moment. It's a portrait of a community. It's a moment in time, but also it's about a complex history. Just today I was reading Ranjit Hoskote, obviously who's a Bombayite, has written about
Right.
Bhanu, written an essay about Bhanu Ataya, who just passed away,
Hmm.
the Oscar-winning
Right.
um, designer of Gandhi,
Designer.
and
Yes.
the designer, and she previously was part of people. Many people don't realize, but she was part of the inception of the Progressive Artists Group, which took place in the late 40s in Bombay, when a number of people,
Right.
kind of at the fringes of the JJ Art School, kind of created this new art movement.
Right.
And Hoskote
Yes,
has
I
a
did.
you did read the piece that Hoskote just wrote?
No, I haven't. I haven't. But I know
Okay,
about
well,
her role in that. Yeah.
Banu. Yeah, so
Yes.
one of his points, which is very valid, is that somehow in the post in the 1940 in post independence, and then particularly now in an odd and bizarre way, there's a kind of desire to look for pure Indian roots, and things that appear hybrid or don't appear to be 100% Indian by some bizarre kind of reckoning, fall out of the margins of what we know to be our past, what we know to be our experience. And I don't just mean this as Goans, but in the city of Bombay, you have this very rich history of different communities, and one of the things that you've done so well here is evoke one separate strand of this history, which is actually very important. You mentioned the three mayors of Bombay. I think we've discussed this earlier. I know someone. I think Julia Ribeiro has got
Yes.
has got
His
roots in
family
Cavell,
was, yes.
has some roots in Cavell, and many other important people and important process took place via Cavell and neighborhoods like Cavell, in the making of who we are.
Right.
So which makes it kind of an absurdity and also an abomination to whitewash this part out of it. So tell me now, right now in Cavell, you talked about when you moved here, it being kind of a still an insular community, but just a short while later, you talked about moving in the early part of this century, but just a few years ago, you were already kind of lamenting the loss of it. What is happening in Cavell now? I mean, are these buildings? I know there are buildings in Bandra like the Salset, um, uh, buildings associated with that Salset society where you can only
Right.
sell to people within the community. Is there
Yes.
something like that
Yes.
happening in
Right.
Cavell as well?
So there are two townships here. We call them townships. They are amusingly named Popestown and Bishopstown, and it's quite funny. So we have in both these towns we have two really old buildings, and both of them are owned by Catholic trusts. So that means that you cannot sell the property. And our building is owned by the cathedral, the Roman Catholic Cathedral Trust. So that means you cannot really sell the property to anyone outside the community. That is a good thing and even not. But we can see both sides of it. Um, what is happening is that beyond these two townships, and I think these townships in themselves are very insular, because there is they're very different from the rest of Cavell. So the rest of Cavell, you have these buildings that exist some here and there, pockets, and most of them are now going in for redevelopment. They are not owned by Catholic trusts, and the residents from these buildings, the Christian residents from these buildings, are moving out because we have the underground metro that's passing Chira Bazaar, which is just a few meters away from Cavell.
Right.
And the entire township beyond Cavell is changing. It's becoming, it's growing vertically. You have these monstrous looking, ugly, I'm sorry to say, but I find them really ugly for a narrow street like ours, a market street like ours. And they're just coming up every year. You have 3 or 4 buildings, and these old buildings going down. What's happening is a lot of Catholic residents from Cavell, Dhobitalau, who lived in these buildings, now have to either move to the suburbs or have to wait before they come back. That means the parishes don't have enough parishioners to even have, say, a Sunday mass. That's what's happening with Cavell. We used to have a mass daily until 10 years ago. And today we're struggling to have 2 masses in the week. So the Saturday mass and the Saturday evening mass and the Sunday mass, it's just something that priests don't know what to do about. We have the daily morning mass, and it's mostly for elderly parishioners. But apart from that, it's a parish that is really struggling to hold. And unfortunately, when the pandemic happened, a decent part of the community had to move because their buildings were bought down, and they've now moved either to different parts of South Mumbai or have moved to the suburbs. So we really don't know when the church does reopen, and we'll see the numbers. It's going to really come as a shock to many of us. I used to be last year, because we did not even have catechism teachers to teach the 3-4 kids who attended catechism, and that is why I decided to become a catechism teacher. And it's strange because I am not someone who would call herself a church-going Catholic. I don't go, I hardly managed to make it for Sunday Mass, but suddenly I was there trying to hold on to something and doing my best to ensure that nothing happens to the community. But even then, over that 1 year where I taught catechism, I remember we started with 8 kids. And just before the pandemic, they were like 2 or 3. So you see that change happening in Cavell, and it worries you because I have seen it in its heydays. And I know that when I came in 2003, it was a beautiful community. I used to find it quirky because and unusual because of how involved they were in the church. Everything revolved around the priest, around youth groups, around these little communities, the small Christian communities, and all of that. And when you're in a small community, there is this weird kind of politics that keeps on happening, which you think would have otherwise completely been avoidable. And families are related, families are connected. Even though I am an outsider, I know a lot. We are in some way connected to other families living here, because my aunt's family, somebody married from my aunt's family, and so it's just so incestuous that way. Everyone is somebody else's cousin, and it's just amusing to see this kind of relationship for starters, and then you see what is happening to it now, and it just makes you feel very, very sad.
Yeah, I think this is a story we right before we I think earlier today when I spoke to you for a couple of minutes. It's very reminiscent. I didn't think it would happen. I actually did not think, as I told you, I was born in Bombay and my family has deep roots there also, the way Goans. I never thought it would actually happen in my own lifetime, but it is. We are kind of following in the track of Parsis, who also have faded away as a community from Bombay. I mean, they faded away globally, which
Right.
probably we don't have that much of a problem in that regard. Certainly less so, but it's a community whose impact is dwindling, and the presence is dwindling, and the individuals are dwindling. So let me ask you, you are a young person who clearly cares about this part of your identity. Obviously, we inhabit multiple identities, and this is
Right.
in no way this definition. This is not the only definition of your identity, but you're a person who clearly cares about it enough to write this very lovely book. And here, let me take a minute to point out that on the sidebar of your chat window, you can see a link where this book is available. You can buy a signed copy, and I urge you to do so. It's certainly a beautiful document of a time, of a place, of a community. It stretches from the 1950s up to really 2010, 2015, and it's also a transporting read at the time that we find ourselves. Um, Tell me, what about yourself? You are committed to Cavell. You're committed to Bombay. The fact that you're a journalist, I mean, there's a hard-boiled element to your work, because you've written about gangsters, and you continue to
Right.
take on a number of subjects at midday. I've been reading your work
Right.
with enjoyment for a long time. Your commitment is there, right? You're going to be there. So
Yes.
one day you will
Yes.
be auntie. One day you'll be Auntie Jane, whose
Yes.
memories will be the ones passed on.
Right. I am very committed, and I'm not saying this. I'm not trying to boast, but I think we all need to be committed to the lands we belong to, and I would like to see the same kind of commitment among my peers, among friends who live in Cavell, because this is what we need most. And I'm not saying when I'm asking for commitment, I'm not saying let's be nostalgic and let's try to revive something. I'm saying that we all need to be good memory keepers. We need to do something about this past so that we can have at least some semblance of it in the future. And I am trying to work on something on these lines. I think it will be too early to speak about it, but and a lot of people have even reached out to me saying, why not do something that will help you engage with the real history of Cavell? Because obviously, though I've written Bombay Balchao, it is not, and though we speak about a Cavell in the book, it is not exactly the Cavell that I'm talking about. And Bombay is a sum total of many, many Cavells. You know, there are so many other Christian pockets that whose stories and need to be told, preserved. And if there is something that I can do, I am going to try my level best, despite how busy work keeps me. Um, this is something we all need to do. It's just not me. And I know for a fact that a lot of us want to be involved. We just don't know how and what we can do. And at least that initial, you know, uh, I'm trying to find the right word, but the very fact that you know that you want to do something, I think that's a good start. That will take you somewhere. And that happened with Bombay Balchao. So I knew I wanted to tell Cavell's story, and it happened. It happened 5 years later, but it did. So we need to start somewhere.
That's super interesting. I think maybe spark is the word you're looking for, but
Yes.
or motivation. But I think that's lovely. I do think, I've been noticing a lot. Sometimes when I share or even have written about black and white photographs from our
Right.
past, there's that old Bombay group on Facebook, right, which has got
Yes. That lovely group.
thousands,
Yes. The
maybe
chef.
tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who belong to it. That there's a huge demand and interest in this time. I don't think it's purely nostalgia. It certainly was a simpler time in some ways, less complicated, less what should I say, contested also, where we were not necessarily told that I have to hate you because of your
Right.
background, or whatever, the way you worship, or who you're married to, or whatever your various kinds of identity may be. I think there's that, but there's also the richness, right? One when we have a partly state sponsored, but also kind of a global impetus towards majoritarianism, where we're told narrow our understanding of the past. The
Right.
richness and the complexity of the reality that our lives have been, how our lives have been constructed, comes as a tremendous relief, right? So people love it, and I think that definitely comes across in your book. I look forward to what else you write about Cavell in
Thank
the
you.
future. And also, I hope that you do this. I guess what you're describing is kind of a memory project, some kind of a memory project
Yes.
in the making. I think
Right.
that'll be an absolutely wonderful thing, and I look forward to it. I'd like to ask for questions from our audience. There are a number of people who are tuned in. If they have any questions, please put it up in chat or tell Leonard directly. We haven't heard you read actually a bit of your book. Do you have your book with you, Jane?
Yes, I do. I do.
How
Thank
about
God I had
reading?
the book in here. Yes.
Wonderful. How about reading
Do you
something
have
from you?
something in mind?
Well, I really like your whole introduction kind of, which is called Paper Hearts, right? I'd
Right.
love you to read some of that. Maybe from actually the first page
Okay.
where you start with before we begin, and
Okay.
then read for a
Fine,
bit.
I'll do that.
Super. So
Right.
we understand the
Okay,
actual
great.
kind of.
Yes.
Ashley, do you have a
Yes.
question?
So I think that
One second, Jay. Ashley, do you have a
okay,
question?
there is a question.
You'll have to put Ashley's voice on.
Can
Actually, we can't hear you.
uh, can you hear me?
Yes, I
Now
can.
we can hear
Okay,
you.
okay. I'll wait. Do you hear me? Yeah. No, Jane could tell us more about the discussions over the Padroado and the propaganda in what some historians Goans and Indians. And actually, it's not Goan East Indian. It was the British and the Portuguese. The British didn't like the idea of
Right.
having part of their coming under and they of what went on, which later on took being told as fight between East Indian and so it's really which is actual.
Okay, so we
Yeah,
couldn't hear you.
I couldn't hear the question
Let,
properly,
let
but
me let me
I know
re-
what he's talking about.
Jane, can I? Yeah. So let me, for the
Yes.
purpose of our listeners, let me rephrase. I think Ashley is asking about the divide between the Padroado, which was the Catholic Church
Yes.
dominated by the Portuguese polity, and the Propaganda Fide, which was
Yes.
global under the Vatican, but also definitely promoted and supported by British colonialism,
By the British.
which were these
Yes.
kind of vying Catholic schools, which played out with some
Yes.
deleterious effects in Bombay. So please go ahead.
Right. So
Correct,
what
Ashley?
happened?
Thumbs up, Ashley.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes. So
Right,
what
right.
happened is, so what I was saying is definitely it was not between the Goans and East Indians. It was a larger, the whole Padrado propaganda had a lot to do with the British and the Portuguese in Bombay. But the Goans decided to align with the British at that point, and
East
so this
Indians.
is how
East Indians.
East Indians. Sorry, the East Indians aligned with the with the East Indians aligned with the British. Yes, and this is where it all fell apart. So for the Goans and East Indians, because churches now were divided between the two communities. It was not between the Goans and East Indians as much as it was between the British and the East Indians, and who aligned with whom. And that is what led to, like he said, a street fight. It was literally, it got very, very ugly from what we read in history. And there was immense hatred between
Jane, we can't hear you. I can't hear Jane.
Sorry, I was unmuted for some reason. Can you hear
Okay.
me?
Yes, now we
Okay,
can.
that's so strange. Yes. I said that, I don't know where you lost me though.
A minute
Hello?
ago.
Oh God, that was a long time. So what I was saying is that between these two schools, between these two Catholic ideas, um, um, there was someone who aligned with someone, and which is why this viciousness between the communities, obviously that doesn't exist anymore. But strains of it are still visible. As we see, there are prejudices, and some of them don't make sense to any of us right now. Even the kind of prejudices that we see between the Goans and the Mangaloreans that exist, very superficial for that matter. But yes, so that is the history that goes back there. And the reason why I brought it up here is because of the way the East Indians and the Goans in Cavell aligned themselves to different churches, which were in the same pocket, on the same street, not very far from each other, just about 500 meters from each other. And that kind of really affected how communities within Cavell saw each other.
That's fascinating. I've actually,
Yes.
I don't know, I actually may be able to fill in more. I don't know that much about this particular history, but
Yeah, yeah.
I do think that this explains a lot of the things that we grew up with. For instance, when I was living in Bombay as a child, I went to a school in South Bombay, which was called in the military area, called St. Joseph's RC Church. Right? I never understood why
Yeah,
you had to have. I know what it is, but I never understood why you had that. Like, why did they have to say RC Church
yeah,
on top
yeah,
of the St. Joseph's?
yeah.
This is probably the reason. I mean, I haven't thought
Yes.
about it, but too hard. But this is probably the reason why it's RC Church, as opposed to say maybe I don't know. I need to find out more. But as opposed to say the Woodhouse
See,
Cathedral,
so here,
or maybe
I
even
think
Blessed Sacrament Chapel.
Dr. Fleur, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Dr.
yeah. So
Fleur
I'm going to
D'Souza
ask.
had something to say. I think she had a
Yes,
comment here. Yes,
I'm going
yes,
to read it out. I'm going to read it out, and
yes, yes,
thank you so much, Fleur, for this. Here's what Fleur says. Okay,
yes.
Fleur says it is naive to look at the Padroado propaganda divide as a Goan East Indian divide.
It is
His
definitely.
history of
It is.
suburban Bombay will put an end to this idea. My grandfather, an East Indian, was firmly on the side of the propaganda and was ostracized by the East Indian community who stood firmly behind their Goan priests. Dr. Fleur, perhaps you can you unmute yourself and tell us a bit more, because this makes it much more complicated. What you are saying is she? Can you do that? Thank you, thank you. So you are saying, if you don't mind me repeating, you are saying that your grandfather was an East Indian and he was on the side of the propaganda, and he was
Yes,
ostracized by the East Indian community who stood
yes.
firmly behind their Goan priests. I don't fully understand that.
Oh, because the propaganda Padroado divide was not just South Bombay, and that's where everybody makes the big mistake. Oh,
Okay.
please understand that the divide went up to Vasai, up to Basin, because this whole area was Catholic. And most people look at Bombay as just South Bombay, and that's where this problem comes in, where they look at this divide as being East Indian Goan. It had nothing to do with that. Um, uh, a lot of the East Indians felt that under the propaganda, which was sponsored by the British, the Jesuits were called in, and because they uh, set up in places like South Mumbai, it was South Bombay, that's Dhobi Talao, and Dhobi Talao mainly. It was the Goan community who benefited from the Jesuit education. So I know that my grandfather was one, even though we lived far away from city center, who felt that the East Indian community was deprived of a Jesuit and a more progressive education. Because very frankly, the Portuguese priests did little or nothing for education in the suburban centers. The school in Thana, where I live in, was just is just 100 years old, whereas St. Xavier's College, St. Xavier's School, 150 years old. St. Mary's, more than that. So a certain section of the East Indian community felt that they were being deprived of this education, and they petitioned the Pope to settle this divide. But very frankly, older members of the community here in Thane told me how his father and my grandfather were ostracized because they saw them going against the holy priesthood, and they were not invited to social occasions, etc. So it's not the whole East Indian community firmly behind the propaganda, and it's
I agree.
And I don't think it was the whole Goan community firmly behind the Padroado either. So I wouldn't put it down to that, even though Teresa Albuquerque does.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a very valuable set of points. Actually, I think that this whole issue became more complicated in the last 150 years. Earlier than that, the kind of divide that Jane is talking about most likely dominated, but it did become more complicated. It certainly in Goa themselves, the priesthood, the Catholic priests, if you like, did very little for education in Goa as well, right? The majority of Goans who aspired into the middle class and so on, starting in the 19th century, either got their education outside Goa or they got their education in English language private schools within Goa, and then migrated. It's a history of a community that made it, if you like, in migration, not so much in Goa.
Right.
So I think those divides are there. There's another question or point actually from Kevin Frank Fernandez, and Kevin says the divide continued south to Mangalore as well. If Kevin would like to sign in, Kevin can unmute his mic and tell us a little bit more.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I'm probably the only Mangalorean here. So I'm not very well versed on how exactly. I'm not very well versed how exactly it moves further south. But I am aware that for the longest time there was a problem with the appointment of bishops. As to who would appoint it, whether the bishops would come from Goa or they would be appointed through the intervention of the Jesuits, who also had a very strong presence here. But I actually have a couple of questions for Jane and Vivek, both in conversation with each other. My questions revolve around the idea of memory, and the phrase you used was memory keepers. I have two questions on those lines. One, what happens with those memories that are redundant? Memories of customs, memories of beliefs and practices. For example, the way communities treat divorcees, or the way communities treat, let's say, widows. Right? There is a problem with the way in which we look at these things. How do we incorporate these things as keepers of memory? That's my first question.
One second, Kevin. You probably don't mean redundant, right? You say memory keepers, so you mean people who have negative or reactionary kind of approaches? Is that what you mean? Redundant?
No, when we talk about memory keepers, see, the novel becomes a form or a space to keep memory, right? To document. So my question is, so when you document memory, we're documenting culture through memories of people, through lived experiences. What happens to those aspects of culture which no longer hold water today? For example, I understand that for intermarriage between communities, let's say between a Goan and a Mangalorean, was frowned upon for the longest time.
Right? Archaic, you mean archaic? Yeah, sure.
Which is why I said redundant, right? They no longer hold water in our times. They serve no purpose. So what does a memory keeper do there? I mean, do you have the liberty to weed out these memories, these customs, these traditions? Or as a keeper, do you have the burden of documenting these things as well? That was my first question. My second question is your location. You spoke about how you yourself moved into that place later on in the history of that particular community. So in some sense, you are an outsider. And so what has been the response of people within the community, people who have lived there for 2 or 3 generations? At any point, have they turned around and said, what gives you the right to talk about us? Has there ever been that kind of insider-outsider discussion?
Right. So thank you so much, Kevin, for the questions. I'll first answer the memory keeper question. I think we have the responsibility, as if and when I do start, working on something on these lines, we have the responsibility of keeping, recording or documenting all kinds of stories. And this is one thing that I tried to do with the book. Something like, when you're talking about a marriage between a Goan East Indian or a Goan Mangalorean, it might seem like, why do I need to even bring these 3 communities or the conversations between these about the friction that used to once exist between the communities now, because it doesn't make sense to any of us. But I thought, because I have grown up listening to snatches of these things, and sometimes about the prejudices between the communities, and I really did not know the backstory to it at that point. I did try and bring that up in the book. I did have those questions raised, which is a lot of young people came back to me and said, hey, I did not, I've always heard my parents speak ill about a certain community, and I really did not know the backstory. And you brought that out. It now makes sense to me. And we need to sometimes go back to the past, recall these histories, even if they make absolutely no sense to us. Why would there be so much bitterness between 3 different kinds of communities when they have very similar overlapping customs and cultures? These things need to be bought, and not to remind you how archaic they are, but to remind you how they shaped our histories and what we are as people today. And so that was I hope I answered your first question. About the second one, yes, I'm sure nobody has really come back to me and told me that you've written rubbish. And this is not how our community or Cavell, this is not Cavell. But I did speak to a lot of the earlier residents here before writing this story. One of them is my aunt, Vivian De Silva, who's now Vivian Goddett, and she lives in Montreal, Canada. She had written memoir about growing up in Cavell.
Is she online? I think.
Is she online?
Vivienne. I think so.
Is she? I can't see her. If she is.
Vivienne, Vivienne.
Yes. Is she there?
Yes. Hi, Auntie.
Auntie Vivian, are you there? Okay. So she had written a memoir about Cavell and she and she wrote it for her son and her granddaughter, my cousin. When I read the story, and hers was, she was very nostalgic about the place because she moved to Canada in the 1970s. And there were snatches of history and stories and the life in Cavell that I was completely unaware about. I had never heard of those things. And something very ceremonial that took place in church then, which does not exist today. And Auntie Vivian talks about it in the book, in her memoir. So these were things that I brought out, though they did not exist, and which is why this book probably goes back so much into the past. And and I'm only imagining it. I'm imagining it from the voices of people who I have heard and who I have witnessed, who have spoken to me about these stories. So I think everything in the book has there is some sense of reality to it. Whether it is the water pipeline issue, we still do have tremendous problems with water. There is, we all have to in Cavell get up at 5:30 in the morning to fill water in our tanks. Then whether it is the issue of a fireman, for instance, we did have my neighbor, Auntie Lulu Days, her brother-in-law was a fireman, and Cavell lost him in the 1944 dockyard blast. So, and they never retrieved his body. So there was never any sense of closure for the family. And this is a memory that many Cavelites um, remember and talk about even today. And even Auntie Vivian mentions it in her memoir. So it just goes to say how much these stories, no matter how long ago they were, mean to residents who've been part of this place at some point in time.
Okay. Thanks very much for those questions, Kevin. I think, since you said I could also talk about them. The question about memory keepers, complex one in the case of the novel. I'm guessing you're a reader, so you realize that it depends on the novel, what the novel is intended to do. It depends on the writer's point of view. There is something called verisimilitude, the appearance or the the what should I say, the believable appearance of reality in your book. I think Jane certainly achieves that in her book. And if a book doesn't have that, if you're leaving out sections that are glaring or that do not actually, they don't all add up in terms of a cultural point of view or cultural picture, then your book fails. It collapses. It becomes a kind of propagandistic effort.
Right.
And so I think that's something to keep in mind. But obviously everything is not necessary. I mean, a book, a novel, a successful novel, a successful book is not the sum of its parts, really, and you don't have to add every little bit to it. It works that way. Question of outsider insider is interesting. I think that in a way, perhaps Jane is lucky that nobody has told her she's that it wasn't like this. How dare you?
No,
I know that
the noise
sorry.
has not reached me yet. The noise has not reached me yet. I'm sure people are talking about it.
Right. Well, the thing is, like, I know in a place like Goa, certainly in a place like Mangalore as well, I'm part of this giant mailing list, somehow added to a giant mailing list of Mangalorean intellectuals and writers. And I see the battles in there or sometimes the occasional battles in there. But certainly when it comes to Goa, our cultural territory is highly contested, right? And if you almost anything that you can write, there's a bunch of people saying, how dare you? This is garbage. This is directly opposite to my experience. One of the things that is and it's a complex picture. I know that when it comes to Mangalorean history, which is so rich and so absolutely fascinating, including that genocidal attempt by Tipu Sultan that many Mangaloreans themselves don't know about. I know that there isn't a very good book of history. I mean, you look for a good book on the Mangalorean history, and you have some things written by Alan Machado, which is about as much as there is. There isn't very much. I think the academic Sujata Fernandez, who lives in Australia, is writing something, or is in the process of writing something that might work out. But we don't have it. When it comes to Goa, if you ask me for a good history book, I can't really give you a recommendation. I would have to give you 4 or 5 different recommendations, and they each come at the history in different ways. It's complex. But one of the things to answer directly Kevin's question, one of the ways that you get away with it, and it's quite unfair, is by actually having what are considered to be insider credentials, right? So, I mean, very often when it comes to writing about Goa, I think it'll be the case when it comes to writing about Catholic Indians or Catholic Bombayites for sure. The first question is like, who is he? Who is she? Well, what church does she go to? Who are her parents? Those are the kind of questions that go on and on. I know that when it comes to art, I'm digressing a little bit, but when it comes to art, we just recently had this very interesting question. So who are the artists from Goa? Who are Goan artists? And we have 2 wonderful examples of this, which played out last year at the end of last year. So you have Amruta Patil. Many of you may have heard of Amruta Patil. Yes. She's a wonderful graphic novelist. She grew up in Goa. She spent her entire education in Goa through Goa College of Art, and she's written these graphic novels. And now she lives in Goa again, right? And she's doing books, but yet in the bookshop that exists in Goa, in the shelves of Goa books, Amruta's books are not there. Right? And I invited last year, at the end of last year, Solomon Souza, who is a who's a British Israeli grandson of Francis Newton Sousa, to come to Goa. Never been to India before, never been to Goa before. And the day he arrived, he's embraced as a Goan artist, right? So everyone's like, our Solomon, our Solomon. And we had these conversations actually as part of Serendipity Arts Festival, which is like, how does it happen? How does it happen in this way? And it's a complex thing. I think that the fact that if Jane lived in Bandra, or she lived in Andheri and had written about Cavell in the exact same book, possibly she would have received more flack. But the fact that she is invested in Cavell and she lives in Cavell, I think it's a wonderful thing. That's how it is.
Can
Yeah,
I add something here? I just remembered
Sure.
something that happened very recently, and one of my neighbors who's now who's staying in Goa at the moment. She mentioned that somebody had spoken about my book to her in Goa, and she was very excited that somebody had mentioned my name in some place in Goa. She didn't know that the book was doing so well. So she was very happy for me. And then I told her, yes, you must read the book because it's about Cavell. But it's not, of course, about the real Cavell. It is about a place that might just remind you of home. And she said something to me that hit me, and that's when I'm talking about the outsider insider debate here. She said that, of course I would know what the real Cavell is because I have lived here all my life, and thereby hinting that I had not lived there my entire life. And if she had read the book, she would be in a position to tell me that this book was from Cavell or no, was about Cavell or not. So I think a lot of residents do feel that way. And for starters, I'm not trying to portray myself as a historian, neither am I saying that I'm a writer writing about Cavell. I'm a novelist trying to recall a place that I truly and deeply love. And the experience is very much part of my system and my being. And I just wanted to bring it alive. That's all.
That's wonderful. We've actually gone past an hour.
Yes, I realized.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Great questions. Loved also the intervention in a way by the Soul Mangalorean, Kevin. Thanks so much for that. I would also urge you to please buy the book. It's available on the link on the side, and if you click on the link, you'll get a signed copy from Jane, which is wonderful. Jane, perhaps we can leave with your voice reading out the passage that you have selected.
I will.
Is that possible? Thank you so much, by the way.
Right, yes.
It's been a really interesting session. I hope we can continue. Please tune in
Thank you
next
so much, Vivek.
Not at all. I just want to because we'll end fairly abruptly after this. I would like to say thank you to Leonard for hosting this series of conversations. There's another one next week. Please tune in, but also please try and get this book again. Please go ahead, Jay.
Yes. And before I start reading, I again want to thank you, Vivek, and thank you so much, Leonard, for having me here. I also want to specially thank Dr. Fleur D'Souza because she was among the last few people I spoke with before making a lot of changes in my book. And she did mention, and a lot of Cavell's history has been written by Goans, which is something that Dr. Fleur D'Souza had pointed out to me. That means that the East Indian narrative has completely been sidelined or has been lost. And I hope someone, and nothing can be done or we cannot undo the past, but someone does something about that from the community there.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yes? Okay. So this is the first chapter, Paper Hearts. So every chapter in my book has a month and a year. This one is from December 2015, and the protagonist Michael is remembering, or something about the ambience. This particular day reminds him of something that's happened 70 years ago. I'm going to read a bit about. I'm going to just read the first 2 or 3 pages that introduces Cavell to you. So here it goes. We never saw snowflakes on Christmas, not in my neighborhood at least. Even if they were to fall from our winter sky, they'd melt into drops of dew, nervously resting on pink petaled flowers. Yet each year, when the cold months set in, we'd secretly wish for a white Christmas so that we could build ourselves a portly snowman with button eyes and a carrot nose. But that sweltering December from 70 years ago dashed any such hopes. Before we begin, you must know where you are. Sandwiched between two bustling bazaars in the south of Mumbai is a winding stretch of road, broken on the edges and pockmarked from years of neglect. From dawn to twilight, hurried feet trample over this uneven strip, while handcarts crush and pound it further, making its presence unsightly. At the mouth of the lane, hanging perilously from a wrought iron pole, is a plaque the color of midnight blue. The inconspicuous sans serif font in waning white reads, Dr. Dilemma Street, Cavell. Back in 1945, there was no signboard to welcome you. There was instead a dirt track that opened into our street, dotted by villas and surrounded by gulmohar and chiku trees. Winter evenings here were always cold and pleasant, if not biting. The raucous hawkers who lined our street would escape early to avoid the nip, and those who stayed built a fire to keep themselves warm. This is why the Christmas Eve from that year stood out like a sore thumb. The light mist that would otherwise float aimlessly under the incandescent glow of the streetlights had not made an appearance. Neither had the shimmering constellation, Orion, a result of stars crisscrossing to create a bow and arrow wielding hunter, had been shadowed by a flock of dark gray clouds. It was a strange night compounded by stranger happenings inside our church. The 400 odd parishioners of Our Lady of Hope, who between caroling and prayer had witnessed one of these incidents, would remember it to their dying breath. For years to come, the tale would be discussed at every social gathering in Cavell, often laced with Goan Balchao masala. It wasn't long before the marinated apocrypha began to vary from household to household. The characters and plot changed with every story, but the residents of Cavell continued to listen to it with the same curiosity and anticipation with which they had heard it the first time around. I never felt the need to contribute to these stories. Mine would only meld into this clutter, and I did not want that to happen. There was another reason. Not only did I have an entirely different account of the incident that set the rumor mills turning, I had also been witness to something that I had deliberately never spoken about. For some reason, I buried this part of my life so deep that even if I wanted to summon it, the memory would be so hazy that it wouldn't cause me an ounce of pain. But our minds are surprisingly gifted with this innate ability to omit events that we do not wish to revisit. A slight trigger and the mind retrieves them for us, playing them out in technicolor. The weather tonight is so much like it was that night in 1945 that the very thought hurts my heart. The air is withdrawn and the clouds heavy, just like that day when I, an awkward teenager of 14, sat in church as Father Augustine Fernandez led the midnight mass. Cavell had its own swing during this season, drawing residents into crazy merriment. The houses in our lane would be lit up with candles, and even the trees abutting them were decorated to shine like the sun. After midnight mass, everyone would throng the compound below my building, 193A Bosco Mansion, at Pope's Colony, for a Christmas party that saw revelers arrive from as far as Mahim, the last stop of the island city before Bombay spilt into the suburbs. Each parishioner had unspoken duties here. While the boys would take care of the bonfire, burning logs of dead wood, and stacks of hay picked up from nearby Crawford Market to light up the grounds, the older men would be immersed in creating potent concoctions of home-brewed alcohol that would be served only after the night got younger. The women, on the other hand, would play kind hosts, first feeding the famished coffee and plum cakes before tempting them with the more delicious mutton and pork chops. But what they all contributed to separately, they compensated together in celebration, as they flirted and danced and even broke into solemn singing, the home favorites being Silent Night and Hark the Herald Angels Sing, leaving only after the sun had ambushed the dark, so that they could prepare for the feasting in their homes to Christmas Day. On that night too, a get-together had been planned. And so hoping in earnest that the weather would not prick our happy bubble, we tried to put our best foot forward. By 11:30 p.m., most of the homes of the street had been abandoned. The click-clack of heavily heeled boots could be heard on the street, usually noiseless at that hour, as the men and women made a beeline to church for midnight mass. Should I continue? This is about it. Then we go on to introduce the parishioners going to church.
That's great.
So
That's
I think
great.
this could be it. Yes.
That is Bombay Balchao. Thank you so much, Jane. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Vivek. Thank you so much.
Rooting for you in this Atta Galata prize also. And yes, I think one of the tests of any of these kinds of books is not just the immediate reception, but how long it is read. And I have more than a suspicion. I think I'm quite convinced that your book is going to be read for a long time. It's certainly a book that I will always recommend to people who want to know about the great city that is Bombay and all of its complexity. It's a wonderful addition to our literature. So congratulations in every way. I loved reading it.
Thank you so much. Thank you again.
I loved reading it at this particular time. Leonard, you want to have some kind of last word, please?
Just thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jane, for accepting our invitation. And thank you, Vivek, for having this conversation. And thanks to all of you who have joined us. Again, like Vivek mentioned, the link to the book is available. So if someone wants a signed copy, because Jane has agreed to sign copy for us, you can buy it from that link. And on this note, I'll end. We have a conversation with Parmesh Shahani next week. His book is called Queeristan, LGBTQ rights in the workplace. So we hope you'll join us for that one too. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Leonard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Yes.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.